I'm Alfred Doblin, and welcome to the Eagleton Center on the American Governor. I'm with former Governor, 54th Governor of New Jersey,
Thank you.
John Corzine. Welcome, sir.
Good to be here, and thank you for agreeing to run me through the questions, and thank Eagleton for doing this project to make sure that there's an archive that people can hopefully learn from.
So why don't we begin with why you decided to get into public service. You were chairman of CEO of Goldman Sachs. You had a storied career in finance. You went into the Senate, and then you decided to run for governor. What was the reason that you decided to leave financial world into the public sector?
You know, I think this is an important question, primarily because it's why I did get into politics, both as a United States Senator and ultimately as governor. I've lived a life of opportunity. Many good things have happened. There are a few that not always perfect, but opportunity and access for a young man that grew up on a farm in central Illinois and had the access at running a great company that had a Jewish heritage, and I'm Christian by background, someone that had a public education almost entirely through my life. I know how important it is to make sure that there are the supports of government and other means for people to have access and opportunity. And so that's why I looked for this chance. And I want to say at the start of this, I don't think there is a better job, maybe the presidency is, than being a governor, because you get to focus on presenting opportunity with equity for everyone if you're doing your job appropriately. You get a chance to be competent about how you lead, and I think you get to lead with how you lead really determines whether your administration carries itself out with a degree of integrity and again, competency. So I think it's the greatest job I've ever had. And I hope this conversation can help others learn maybe a little bit about what it's about.
Well, before we get into the meat of our conversation, I think people may forget, the particular skill sets that you do bring to the table. And coming from the private sector, at the point that you were elected, previous governors they came out of government, whether they were prosecutors, whether they were working as elected officials. There actually was this sort of cry for someone. Okay, they've actually worked in the private sector. They understand the way money is raised, how it affects people. Can you talk just a little briefly about that unique skill set you brought to the table?
Well, I think there are two areas that private work experience allows one to help them in public life. One, I think that there is a demand for competency, excellence in the private sector if you're going to succeed. So it sets a standard, sets a bar that I think for you to be successful in one or the other, you have to meet that bar. And so I think it's a mindset that's important, that you demand that of yourself. Second, I think that while there's plenty of politics in private life, relationships are very important. And so your ability, particularly when you're in the mode of trying to get other people to use your service or buy your product or whatever it would be, I think really does help in the long run in your relationship with the public. Maybe it doesn't help you quite as much in government, although I thought, particularly when I was a United States Senator, it was very, very helpful because you develop personal relationships. a little more difficult in Trenton because people didn't spend as much time together. And I was a little more of a foreign element coming in with perspectives that were significantly different. But I think the competency measure and the relationship building method, I think, are very, very important ingredients that you bring from the private sector.
Well, let's get into sort of the meat of our conversation. We're going to break up today's conversation into sort of 4 blocks. And the first one we're going to talk about is the budget. Whether it's, I think it's more being famous rather than infamous. The state had to shut down your first year of the budget. The term is you brought in the mattresses. I think you brought in a cot. But can you talk a little bit about that whole process, because you weren't dealt a good hand coming in as governor. I think the projected shortfall, I could be a little wrong, was around $3.6 billion. It's a lot of money.
Off of about a $28 billion budget, so it's more than double digit.
So can you sort of walk us through? People remember, okay, the government shut down. You called in the mattresses. You sort of had you had a victorious moment in the end, but it wasn't easy.
Right. It also had long-run implications, which we can talk about too. I have to frame this. This gets at that competency issue that I talked about. At a state level, as opposed to the federal level, you do have to have revenues that match expenditures. And we had a mess because we had historically used what were called one-shots in Trenton, but one-off revenues to match up a large portion of the budget. And there was never a real willingness to raise serious amounts of money in taxes. One of the reasons I admired Brendan Byrne, he took on the income tax so you could fund education in this state. And it was a tough decision. Generally, Democrats have been left with trying to figure out how we're going to pay for the kind of social initiatives, education, other things that are on our agenda. And it isn't always put together very well. And as you indicated, we started off deeply in the hole. We put together a budget, and I thought that it was appropriate that we raise taxes to help close the systematic shortfalls that we were having. This wasn't a one-time $3 billion shortfall. It was every year, and we were robbing from Peter to pay Paul, weren't putting money into a pension system that we were ultimately going to have to pay for. So there were just big financial problems within it. So we tried to restructure it, and it needed new revenues, and the legislature was not inclined to do that. They, by the way, had an election in the subsequent year that this budget was going to be implemented, and they didn't support it. And it was Democrats that were resisting.
And it was a 1 cent increase in the sales tax, correct?
Well, it was 1%.
1%, I'm sorry, 1%.
From 6 to
6 to 7.
One of the reasons that I thought it was reasonable, a lot of people would say sales taxes are regressive, but we have these enterprise zones that are in all of our urban communities where there are no sales taxes. Plus, we had a laundry list of things that are basic needs that people didn't have to pay sales tax on. If you bought toilet paper, you don't pay sales tax on it. Anyway, the point being that you could make it more progressive than it stood on its surface, but you would be able to raise probably about half of what we needed to do to close our budget. Not everything that we needed to do, but something. But I got very little support in the legislature, and so we went to the mattresses. There was no budget on June 30th, and we had to decide whether we were going to cave into the proposals that the legislature was making, which were not going to cover and put us on a path that I thought would be sound for the 4 years that I would be governor. It was over the 4th of July weekend, and one of the ways that I tried to make sure the public understood was the governor sleeping in the State House for 5 or 6 nights, I can't remember exactly, until we were able to solve this budget. We also had special sessions of the legislature every morning at 9 o'clock. So we had everybody come in and sit down, and I'd come down and give a brief state of the state, which was, we need to get revenues to make sure there's budget balance. And it didn't go so well for a while, but as it dragged on, 5 or 6 days, people started looking for compromises, and we ultimately got to an agreement that while we raised the sales tax as much as I had proposed, 1%, half of it had to go to property tax relief, which was okay with me because you could use it in various ways that would help the citizens, and we'd use the other half for other elements of the budget. So it ended up getting to a conclusion that I think in the long run helped me with the public, because they knew I meant business about trying to run the government competently and appropriately financially. It probably did not help me long run with the legislature. A little bit out of the norm in how governors had dealt with the legislature. But I think necessary if you were going to actually try to restructure the finances of the state, and we'll talk more about that in other areas. Most of the things we'll talk have a lot of intersectionality to them. If you talk infrastructure, you're talking about raising money. How are you going to do that? Well, this is one of those things that we thought was a building block that would allow us to get to a long-term stable position financially.
From your perspective now, would you still have done it the same way? Because it's very difficult when people look back and they sort of forget the way it was at those minutes of like, this is how we have to do this. Was the impact in terms of the legislatures, they just didn't expect you to actually play hardball with them, and you were really willing to do it. Do you think you would redo it now if you could, or you really just made the best decision at that moment?
I think you can always do things better, and there were elements of the compromise at the end that I probably would very much like to do different, where they had some things that they call Christmas trees, and I probably gave away more than I needed to in those to try to get folks to come on board. But I think that it was an important statement that my administration was going to be serious about being financially responsible, even though we had important ideas about how we wanted to serve the people, and with education, social services, and lots of good things on our agenda. But we wanted to do that in a financially sound way, not what I perceived as historically a lot of gimmicks that had allowed us to get to, I think, a dangerous precipice. And that was showing up, by the way, in our credit rating agency analysis of the state. And we actually got ready for an upgrade from the credit rating agencies, and we were still AA at that time, I think. Could have been A1. But anyway, we were about to get upgraded, and then the recession of 2008 and 9 came along, and that sort of put all the states back in the box.
Now, you also, though, tried to curb the growth of the actual mechanism of state government. I mean, the workforce you reduced. I think you first reduced the folks within the executive area. But you try to
I
broaden
looked
that.
this one up. We went from 68,000 when I came in to 62,000, 61.7 or so on personnel. We did it through attrition. Didn't make me that popular with some of the folks who were very big supporters in the labor movement, public employees, but there was a lot of excess and I think necessary restructuring. And there were some things that needed to be added. We put in a controller, which was a position that was an independent agency that was checking our bidding processes and how we spent money, and we put a prosecutor in charge of it, a fellow named Matt Boxer, who did a terrific job, stayed in the next administration and did the same for the Christie administration. The whole point was there was more than just balancing the books. You had to manage government appropriately. Well, I think we had one fire sale on cars that we were servicing at, I don't know, $1,000 a year in a contract, and we cut them in half. There was a lot of excess that needed to be pulled out of government in a lot of different ways so that we could better afford to do the things that we needed to do on education, social services, healthcare, et cetera.
Well, in that sort of intersectionality, which is a cool word, let's move a little more into the financial, which is a good connection to the budget. One of the things, you tried to do a number of things where I think the term might be you sort of planted seeds for things that became popular after your term. You know, where I believe state employees had to start paying for their health care, a small portion. That was like revolutionary at that time.
We raised the retirement age
From 60 to 62.
Which ultimately should have gone higher, but we got what we could get. We actually started putting serious dollars into the pension system after my term. People did it more, and recent governors have actually been required in a statutory sense to properly fill the pension fund, make up for enormous holes that had built up over the previous 10, 15 years when we came in. We put more in my 4 years than had been put in the last 20 years preceding us into the pension system. We did that on other, the unemployment trust fund. There were a number of those things. Unfortunately, it was sort of a before and after. We had 2 years of a great economy in 2006 and 2007, and so we had greater ability to make choices. As most of us know, the Great Recession came along with the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the whole problems of Wall Street in 2008. And we ended up with unemployment going from, I think it was 3.5% to 10 plus in about 6 months, and our state revenues collapsed. I think we ended up with a $4 or $5 billion hole, even after we'd done all the corrective measures, because there was no income to be taxing and people weren't spending money on sales. So we had a different set of problems after the recession than we did before. And I ended up having to resort to one-times to balance the budget and still keep things going. Didn't like it, but we didn't have any choice. We stopped putting money in the pension system the last year that I was governor. There were very few options if you were going to keep funding education, if you're going to keep money flowing to the hospitals and other things that we were trying to do. But long term, we had other plans we'll probably talk about this, is one of the things that I thought was a really big idea that would straighten out finances for a long period of time looking forward, catch us up on the pension system almost entirely, and give us the resources to do infrastructure spending in an enormous way for a state that is its heart and soul is actually transportation, because we're a connector state and people drive through it, and we are a commuter state. So vital that we do it. We were going to do the asset monetization project with regard to the turnpike, which was going to produce the kinds of revenues that would allow for us to address these long-term problems, and I think would have made a huge long-term difference in the financial capacity of the state to serve the needs of the public.
Well, let's bounce a little between the little blocks that I have in mind, because we really financial.
Well, that's why I say
there is intersectionality. Asset monetization. You and I had a conversation before your accident. It was, I think, a few weeks before, and you were talking to me about, you had this great idea and you were trying to explain it to me, and you didn't use asset monetization, but you were trying to explain it sort of a little bit like Brit Rail. You said, and saying you were trying to, that was how you were trying to get me to understand what it was. Do you feel asset monetization, it was in some ways too big an idea for people to grasp? It was the right idea, but sometimes things are just too hard to understand.
Sometimes that can very well be the case, but the problems of the state with regard to our pension system and the unbelievable needs we have to finance serious addressing of our physical infrastructure. I don't have to tell you, you now work at the Port Authority, and we have a tunnel under the Hudson River that 120 years old, breaks down in whim of any heavy wind or heavy rain. The electricity is malfunctions on a regular basis, and there are all kinds of bridges and roads and things that have not been upgraded for the 21st century, sometimes not even for the 20th century. And we had huge capital needs. And so I believe that a big idea was necessary. Maybe I wasn't the greatest salesman in the world, because I was not able to convince folks that a little bit of short-term cost would lead to long-term benefit for the broad society. And we tried, went to town hall meetings all over the state, made presentations, but it had one flaw that you could argue very easily in a soundbite, that your tolls were going to go up 800% over 8 or 9 years. By the way, they've already gone up that amount without the benefits of asset monetization, but it was an easy soundbite at the time and made it a very difficult political sale. There were other issues that were complicated that people didn't fully understand, but I think that the benefits were not appreciated, I think, by the broad public as well as they should be, and I blame myself for not communicating that appropriately, because there was a lot to be said about how we would be able to do better in education, have more funding, because we'd taken care of our pension problem and wouldn't have had the money that was coming in the normal course could have been used for the things that people really wanted. It wasn't just infrastructure, it was the ability to do things that government has a responsibility to do.
For people watching this conversation, a lot of people just know, okay, asset monetization, but they still don't actually know what it was. Could you explain, what, in a simple way, really what would it have done? Because people got caught up on tolls and they didn't get past that.
Okay. It's actually not a very complicated issue. Matter of fact, it's something that's done frequently, regularly in the financial world, almost every day. People monetize rental payments. They monetize lottery payments. They monetize car loans. It's standard operating procedure in the financial world. What we did, we have one unbelievably great asset that the state of New Jersey was wise enough to put together in the late 40s. It's called the New Jersey Turnpike. They bought the land, put the property together. All we were trying to do is we will go out and receive a payment for the future flow of the tolls and use that money to do the things that we wanted to do. Very simple. Use the turnpike as collateral with the flow of toll money paying off the bonds that we were going to issue to allow us to do the things that we wanted to do with the funds. And it to me, I didn't do a good job of explaining. I hope I did a better job here.
Actually, you did. I don't think at the time, if I remember correctly, I don't think the word collateral came up enough in like average conversations. People got caught up in exactly what is asset monetization as opposed to this is going to be, this roadway is the collateral for us to do other things.
Exactly.
So one of the great victories, that I think even your critics would say was an incredible victory, had to deal with the Abbott decision. If I recall correctly, Abbott began as a very narrow decision involving, I think, 4 districts. Then I believe it was 31. I could have my number
31.
wrong. 31. And you successfully, and there were many people before.
Abbott had been unaddressed on a constitutionally sound basis or a constitutionally acceptable basis for, 25, 30 years. So almost from its inception.
And it became it was an equity issue because the money for what were original Abbott districts, or part of that 31, like a place like Hoboken,
exactly,
had a huge renaissance, huge amount of money coming in. The money didn't follow the students' needs, which I think is the core of really what your argument was. And no one had figured out how to do it, and it actually passed muster with the court. Can you talk a little bit about that, about the success of your administration, also defending it to the state Supreme Court, but also the equity piece? That the goal was that the money would go to where the needy students were.
This goes back to what I said at the start. Opportunity is the driver of why equity and opportunity are the drivers of why I got into this activity and service. And I believe that what we did was look at where school lunch programs were most utilized by poor, not looking at geography or zip codes, but where were concentrations of poverty. We made those kinds of variables. Where were people most heavily using Medicaid? And those kinds of variables were built into our formula so that you could argue that money was flowing to where the need was. And then it ended up, the formula sent less money to Hoboken, which was an Abbott district, and shouldn't be receiving as much as it had been receiving, and more money to Rahway, which had a growing population of people that met some of these terms and conditions. And our people did an extraordinary job both legally and I think intellectually, putting together a formula that allocated the resources that the legislature and the governor put forward for educational purposes. Now, it's not perfect, and it needs to be updated because different parts of the state change over a period of time. I heard one of the candidates running for governor this current time is now arguing that Jersey City looks more like Hoboken, and they're getting way too much money relative to other parts of the state. Those things should be able to be addressed by making sure that the factors that go into that formula are allocating it by the student concentration of their needs. And I think it ought to be reviewed every 10 years or every 5 years, upgrade those to make sure that the factors are sound. But we need to make sure that every child has an opportunity to get access to the system. You can't guarantee outcomes, but you certainly are responsible, I think, in government to make sure everybody gets to the starting line with an equal opportunity. Early childhood education, full-day kindergarten, making sure the class sizes are responsible, that people are going to school in buildings that are not 150 years old and can't be wired for STEM education. All that needs to be done, and the formula ultimately is a mechanism that allows that equity to flow through better into our state than otherwise would be the case.
Another huge accomplishment of your administration was putting together the funding for access to the Regions Core, known as ARC. I didn't always agree with
that's that tunnel.
That tunnel. A tunnel that would have been specifically for New Jersey Transit, would have gone into a new terminal station in Manhattan. You and I didn't always agree on some of the pieces of ARC.
Well, we didn't agree on some of the engineering
right.
decisions.
But the putting it together, is an extraordinary lift. It was roughly $9 billion, $3 billion from the state of New Jersey, $3 billion from the federal government, which is a huge lift, and $3 billion from the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which has a New York in it, so that is also a huge lift for you as the governor to put these pieces together. Some of that is because of the relationships I would assume you developed in the Senate in knowing how the federal government worked. But people don't talk about you so much as being someone who brokered those great relationships. So regardless of the fate of ARC, which your successor chose not to continue, it was a huge lift, fully funded.
Well, this is one of those places where both my business background and my time in the Senate did make a big difference, because that $3 billion from the federal government had to be worked over and over and over again. There was a congressman from Minneapolis named Oberstar, and from Minnesota, I think he's from Minneapolis, who I had a good working relationship on other issues. We had worked on some educational issues and had a good conversational, ongoing relationship with, who was the chair of the House Transportation System. And he put phrases in the House Transportation Bill that made the tunnel a national priority. And without that, we could have never gotten the federal funds, even if the president said he wanted to, because the law didn't allow it. So you had to do things like that, which I knew how to do, and we got done. You also had to get the governor of New York and the political establishment in New York to sign off on this in Congress. good relationship with Chuck Schumer and Hillary Clinton didn't hurt one bit in our ability to have that happen. And then you had the Port Authority, where you constantly have to have a good working relationship, or should have a good working relationship, with the governor of New York. And in all those cases we did, and in all three of those parts that you talked about, we were able, over probably 3 years of negotiations or more. The last year I was in Congress, and the first 2 years I was here in New York, and then when President Obama came in, we were able to work to get this all to come together. And the president, because Congressman Oberstar put that phrase in, guaranteed us $3 billion, and the deal was sealed. And we started digging, as you well know, and we have about almost a mile of that tunnel already dug, but it got stopped.
Do you think, I know that the conversation today is on trying to move the Gateway Tunnel, which is a different project, similar in some ways, another Trans-Hudson Tunnel, this one that would be used
solving the same commuter problem that is fundamental to New Jersey's needs.
Yes.
By the way, it helps New York too, so that we can...
The economy works both ways.
Both ways.
But the difficulty today, even with, everyone talks about, infrastructure used to be this bipartisan thing. And in the last administration, state and federal, everyone kept thinking infrastructure deals are about to happen, and they seem elusive for some reason. Could you, from your viewpoint now, forget that ARC wasn't built, you put the package together. What's missing? Why? What would be needed now to take those lessons that people should look at what you did and say, okay, this is how you do it.
Well, I don't want to use the term art of the deal because it's somewhat tarnished, but you do have to make trade-offs with the various parties that come to the table. You can't just demand everything from yourself. That's the art of politics. It's the art of business as well. And so, and if there's too little money to start with for the project, if there was only $5 billion on the table when we were trying to put together our tunnel project, the ARC tunnel project, we could negotiate and have all the best relationships in the world. You couldn't do the deal because it wasn't enough money. One of the problems that you have at a national level now, or had, is that there never really was enough resources on the table. That's why some of the projects that are now being talked about in the Biden administration make a lot of sense, because they're big enough that everyone will get a piece of that pie. There will be, whether it's equitably distributed remains to be seen, but there is enough money to be able to get a lot of people to the table of negotiation. That's what we had happen with regard to the ARC tunnel. And by the way, it also led to the Port Authority putting money into LaGuardia and other things. We had to agree on transactional nature of things that were equitable among the two states. You'll always have to look for reasons that the other person might want to join this effort. And I think that's what we did well, and I think that's what's historically hasn't been done, starting with the not enough money, and then B, I don't think people always are as cooperative as they should be.
Well, to go back to your the original part of our conversation about Skillset, the traditional, more I think in New Jersey than in other states, it's a very parochial view. New Jersey is very much New Jersey. The fact that you came from a huge financial institution and then the Senate, do you think that that skill set really helped ARC in many ways, beyond the actual people that you knew, but the understanding that it's a very large transactional process. It's not horse trading among New Jerseyans. It's figuring out, how do I sell New Jersey to the federal government? How do I sell New Jersey to a equally parochial New York when it comes to their $3 billion? Do you feel that goes back to that skill set, that unique skill set?
Well, I think it helps. I don't think it was the only cause. I mean, there's a fundamental need that was very obvious. For instance, the tunnel helps relieve the pressure on Amtrak, which goes up and down the East Coast. So there were lots of people that didn't like the fact that Amtrak is a broken railroad in many ways and was not functioning properly. So you had different connectors that I think played to our advantage, and I used them to our advantage. And there's another tunnel in Baltimore, so we were able to get some of the folks who were interested in the Baltimore tunnel getting fixed, another 100-year-old plus effort. We got them to be on our side so that we could be there. I think that it takes real work and trying to put yourself in somebody else's shoes to try to get your projects, your initiatives endorsed by other people. And I think business helped do that. I think working in the Senate helped do that.
When you were in the Senate, I think many people saw you as a very progressive. You know, you were instrumental in, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong,
I think Bob Franks called me Mr. Universal for healthcare, a whole series of things.
But financial reforms, you were very interested in Darfur. There were many areas where you had very strong interest in for better phrase of anything, say social equity. And
Right.
that phrase of equity really wasn't being used back then.
Right.
But that's really what, you can look at a number of things that happened during your administration that were huge. One of the first things I'd like to touch on, New Jersey State Troopers. They were, the federal government was keeping an eye on what was going on after a horrible
we're
incident.
under a consent decree.
Horrible incident with troopers, I believe, during the Whitman administration. 4 people were injured. I think three people were wounded.
A bunch of young men coming back from a basketball camp. I used to play basketball, so it caught my attention, and they were very innocent young men.
But that decree was lifted during your administration.
Right.
So can we talk a little on that?
Well, I'm pretty passionate about this because when I was in the Senate, along with a congressman named John Conyers, who ran the Judiciary Committee, was a congressman from Detroit, we wrote the Ban Racial Profiling Act. We never got it passed, but is a forerunner of much of the reform that you hear talked about now, and criminal justice reform in the current era was embedded in that bill. And so I got very, I studied the issue a lot. And New Jersey has many, many inequitable, or had, I think we've made real progress, not only in my administration, but subsequent administrations, towards addressing some of the injustices in the criminal justice system. But racial profiling was a fact, and we addressed it. Under my administration, we put cameras in state police cars. We had to do a lot of things to get out from under the Department of Justice overseeing the administration. We changed the makeup, broadly changed the makeup of the state police. But we have lots of other issues that are just as important. Racial profiling wasn't just a state police problem. We have, 600 municipalities in this state. I wouldn't say all of them had problems on these issues, but we had a major issue where 70% of the people incarcerated in New Jersey when I came in were more or less, I don't know the exact number, were people of color. We had the entrails of the Rockefeller initiatives on drug sentencing. Minor drugs guaranteed you 5 years in jail. We had laws like if you were caught within 250 yards of a school, you would be sentenced, mandatory sentencing with drugs, you had mandatory sentencing for 5 years. There's not a city in the state of New Jersey that almost the whole city is within 250 yards of a school. I mean, that's not entirely true, but generally, if you lived in a city, you were subject to it. There were just a whole host of things that we needed to address. We took it on. We instituted drug courts. We instituted major changes in how parole was implemented. So it wasn't just racial profiling on the turnpike. You had to go after this in a very serious way. Who we put on the bench, we diversified the bench so that there would be greater sense of understanding of some of the issues that were coming up. And as you know, probably one of the things that I was most passionate about almost my whole life was the death penalty. And while it hadn't been utilized in New Jersey for a number of years, I think 70% of the people who were subject to the death penalty were people of color. And if you went across the country, it's disproportionate justice handed out to a narrow segment of our society. Just wrong. I've been against this since I was a teenager, frankly. But it is, we were proud to be the first state in the last, 25, 30 years to do away with it. And we subsequently had a whole flush of other states join us. And I think it represented a real commitment that reflected what was going on in more detailed ways with regard to criminal justice in the state of New Jersey. I'm very proud of it. If you look at any chart of the prison population, it started coming down in 2005, and to the credit of my successors, it's continuing. We were right at the top of the country in incarceration rates per 100,000, and now we're down towards the middle of the pack, and we're falling relatively rapidly. And I'll just say one other thing. Another proud little detail. Camden, New Jersey is one of our poorest communities, mostly people of color. We had the great idea back in the Rockefeller era, I'll pick on them as opposed to a New Jersey governor, and we plopped a prison right down in the middle of downtown. Right in the middle of downtown. It virtually destroyed the commercial activity and the housing activity in the area, and we tore that thing down. And it was emblematic of saying we're going to address the disparities that we have about how our system works for various peoples. We did that both literally, but we also tried to use symbols that would allow people to understand that we were serious about this.
You also made tremendous reforms for youth services. You moved it, if I remember correctly, into its own
Made its own
stand-
standalone department.
And because that was a very plagued government agency,
Right.
and it improved.
Well, it was a plague on our children.
Yes.
I mean, you're an old newspaper guy. I mean, the half of the headlines in the newspapers in the late 90s and turn of the century were kids that are in foster care being abused and sometimes killed. And it just was unacceptable. And, Governor McGreevey worked on this, Governor Cody and my predecessors, but we went after this tooth and nail. I had a gentleman named Kevin Ryan who ran that department, who is one of the experts on child welfare in the country. And we went from a foster care oriented system to an adoptive system for taking care of our kids. The foster care system is filled with injustices, has many good people in it. It also has people who abuse the system for financial gain at the detriment of our kids. And we retooled it. Caseworkers were dealing with 80 and 90 people. This is one of the places where we added people, not reduced the number of employees, because you had to get their workload down to a level where you could actually pay attention to the kids in the foster system. So I'm pretty passionate about this, and we also worked with school districts to make sure that they were red flagging situations in a much more professional and disciplined manner in this case. And we were under another court order there when I came in. That one we didn't get, although we had made huge progress by the time I left the governor's chair.
We'll talk more about the philosophical aspects of your administration in another conversation, but in terms of the action items, for want of a better expression, what are you most proud of when you look back at your term? I mean, because there are many things that I think people don't recognize, like the end of the death penalty happened under you, reforms for, the state police. But what would you put on your, that gives you the most sense of personal pride, that you feel you changed people's lives for the better?
I really think that not me. I mean, one of the things I'm most proud of are the people that I worked with, because they were a lot smarter than me, knew their work. I talked about Kevin Ryan, but I could talk about Lisa Jackson, who went out and run the EPA for President Obama. I had really great people. And I think what I'm most proud of is they kept track of that objective of equity and opportunity in how we tried to govern, to how to create programs and do things. It wasn't just in one area, it was across the board. We also, we really tried to do that with integrity. I think there was no hint of financial scandal or anybody within the till, and when we had anybody close, we unfortunately took pretty strong action pretty quickly about how we responded to those things. I think people have to trust their government to do what it says it's trying to do. And so I'm very proud that I think we sent a message that we were governing for their interests, not for our interests. And with equity always in mind in that process. I could talk about, we haven't talked on social services, we did paid family leave. Equity isn't just a racial issue, it's a gender issue. We had 50% of our cabinet were women. We made strong steps. I sort of criticized myself. When I ran for the Senate, I was for gay marriage, one of the few people that took that on in 2000. We really were able to get to civil unions in my administration, but we put together a court that made judgments that led to the kind of marriage system that I think reflects that we're all equal in this world, that you shouldn't be discriminated under any of those kinds of cases.
There was protection for transgender also in your
Right.
administration. That was new.
But you have to look at equity as being something that everybody should have access at, and not make judgments about other people if they're not interfering in how you're living your life. I feel very, very strongly about that, and I think we're a lot happier as a society if we all bound together on those kinds of feelings about how the world works, and we will get a lot of people who have incredible talent that can get ahead and contribute to everybody's benefit if they have equal access. And I think that's what it's those principles that make me the proudest of the people that I work with, because they work for that every day.
Well, thank you, Governor. I think this is a good stopping point for this conversation. There will be a subsequent one. Again, thank you, former Governor John Corzine. I'm Alfred Doblin, doing this for the Eagleton Center on the American Governor. Thank you.
Thank you.